I nearly always begin anything I do with Nietzsche, with a reading of this passage. It's a very important passage. It's from the Gay Science. It's passage 125. It's probably the most famous passage from Nietzsche. It's often referred to as the death of God passage, and you'll see why. Okay, it's called The Madman. And that's very interesting in a way, because he's making this great announcement, this very prophetic announcement, and yet it's a madman who's doing it. And what makes it doubly ironic is some years later, Nietzsche himself went mad. So it's interesting that Nietzsche has a madman make this great announcement, and you wonder how much Nietzsche identifies with this character. Okay, have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God." As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. "Has he got lost?" questioned one. "Did he lose his way like a child?" questioned another. "Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage? Emigrated?" Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods, too, decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and who is ever born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all hitherto history. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. "I have come too early," he said, and then, "My time is not yet." This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. By the way, I haven't introduced myself. My name is Ken James. I'm a professor of philosophy at Birkbeck College, and also a professor at the New College of the Humanities. Okay, so Nietzsche is very famous for being the philosopher of the death of God. And it's very important to understand what he means by the death of God. The death of God isn't just, he's not arguing here against the existence of God. He thinks that job has already been done. He knows there are still people who believe in God, but he's not addressing those. He's, if you like, addressing those who are already secular, maybe humanists, who've given up religious belief, at least belief in the entity God. Right? But he's trying to tell them, you don't really understand what it means for God to be dead. See, what he thinks is that these people, these secularists or humanists, they've given up in the belief of a benevolent father figure in the sky, but they've kept all those Judeo-Christian values based on that existence. And to really appreciate the death of God is to understand that those values now have absolutely no basis. And that's the point of those people in that audience. They're like the village atheists, and they're laughing, you know, has God emigrated? Has he gone on a holiday? It's all a big joke to them. And he's trying to bring this message to them that you have no idea what this means. And by the way, there's a very deep thought here about what is at the heart of religion. Because we naturally think, oh, what is at the heart of religion? is a set of metaphysical presuppositions, belief, as I said, in a benevolent father figure. But Nietzsche really has a different take on what is at the centre of religion. What is at the centre of religion, and what is most important for Nietzsche, is a set of values. In some sense, in his view, it's kind of condescending. The father figure story is just a just so story we give to kind of rationalise a set of values, to make them look credible. But the real point for Nietzsche, the real point behind any set of religions, is a set of values, a set of normative commitments, not just commitments about belief, but commitments about practices. And what he's really saying with the Death of God passage is he says, look, a lot of you who have given up on the belief of God keep those same normative, evaluative, moral commitments. Really what he calls it is, also in reference to his great teacher, Schopenhauer, is the morality of compassion. Schopenhauer himself was a card-carrying atheist, but Schopenhauer endorsed the morality of compassion. And Nietzsche admired Schopenhauer because he had the strength to realise there is no God. But then he said, but you too, Schopenhauer, are still ensnared in Christianity, or Judeo-Christian values, because the core of Judeo-Christian values is really a morality of compassion. What do I mean by morality of compassion? A morality of compassion is something that treats the suffering of one's fellow humans as one of the most important facts to be addressed. That is, it's our mission to try to ameliorate the suffering of our fellow humans. So what Nietzsche is saying is, he's saying, okay, some of you have given up on God, but you still have that morality. And that is really the core of the Judeo-Christian world. So when you see certain kind of secular movements, typically atheist secular movements, 19th century movements, like socialism or particularly communism, or John Stuart Mill with his utilitarianism, what counts as the greatest happiness of the greatest number. For Nietzsche, it's just Christianity in drag, or if you like, I like to say Christianity without the drag, mainly because it's taken off the costume of the trapping of God, but it still has those essential core values. And what Nietzsche says is, bit by bit, as people come to understand and appreciate the death of God, they're going to see that those core values, the value of compassion in particular, it has nothing to underlie it. That is, before, why did we have to be compassionate to our fellow man? Why do we have to love our neighbour? Well, that was one of the 10 Commandments. It was God's law. But if we don't have God, what holds up that law? It's not that Nietzsche says we have to chuck out that law, but we actually have to either rethink it or find new foundations for it. Okay? And what he predicts is, he says, a lot of people, as the death of God dawns on them, they'll find that they can't find a new basis for these values, and they'll be less and less wedded to those values. And then will come a period, and that's the centre point of this talk, nihilism. Okay? So nihilism is when you lose that external grounding for your values, and you find that your values have no grounding in particular, right? And you lose all hold on values. Okay? And actually, he's very prescient, Nietzsche. He called nihilism the history of Europe for the next 200 years. That's what he was predicting. He said, bit by bit, the message, remember those people, the ones who don't get it at first, the village atheists? He says, light from the distant stars takes time. So he's saying, okay, there are these people who have given up on the belief of God, but they've kept those values. But bit by bit, they're going to realise there's nothing undergirding those values, and those values themselves have now been brought into question. And he says, that's going to be the history of Europe for the next 200 years, that we're going to question those basic values. Okay? So let's take a first stab at what nihilism is. There's a very good book by a Nietzsche scholar called Bernard Regenster. I think it's called Nihilism and the Affirmation of Life. And Bernard introduces two forms of nihilism. The first form of nihilism is the most obvious form. It's what he calls, quite rightly, I think, the nihilism of disorientation. And you can see why. Disorientation. We've lost all values, so we're disoriented. I have to make a little digression here to say it's important that Nietzsche doesn't really believe we lose all values, okay? Because he thinks what life is nothing but a series of drives, bodily drives for hunger, drives to knowledge, sexual drives, whatever drives. This he kind of inherited from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer tended to talk about the will. Where Schopenhauer talks about the will, Nietzsche talks about drives. And Schopenhauer's will was often meant in some kind of transcendental way. Nietzsche's is very naturalistic. The drives are totally embodied. But anyhow, we're a series of drives. That's what life is. And consciousness is just an offshoot from the drives. Very much like Schopenhauer, he says consciousness is in the service of the drives. Now, as long as you have drives, you're valuing, okay? So right now, my thirst drives, as I always use the example, makes me value this Coke. It doesn't make me value this text in front of me, right? But my drive to be a good lecturer makes me value the text and not think that much of the Coke. So Nietzsche can't say that nihilism is the absence of values. As long as you have drives, you have values. What nihilism is the absence of overriding or totalizing values. That is, values that give meaning to all of life, all of existence. Right? When you think about it, well, Christianity clearly does that, right? All of life, all the world is valuable because it's God's creation. It's part of His providential plan, which will end with the second coming and the ascension, or whatever version of Christianity you might have. The utilitarian values the world because the world is a means towards man's happiness, a sunum bonum, okay? It gives a meaning to all of existence, okay? So Nietzsche can allow that even in the absence of God, we can still have, if you like, piecemeal values, the values that our drives assign things. But what we lack is overriding values, and a valuative structure that gives meaning to all of existence. And actually, Nietzsche makes a wonderful point in the third essay of what is now his most popular book at university courses, that's The Genealogy of Morals. In the third essay, in section 28, he says, kind of contra Schopenhauer, he says, people have thought that the problem is the problem of suffering. But the problem of suffering is not man's great problem. He says man will even take on suffering. He will even seek it out. The real problem that faces man is the meaninglessness of suffering. So contra Schopenhauer said, look, the big problem is suffering. Nietzsche says, no. Humans don't mind suffering. As he says, they'll even seek it out. The real problem is that we as humans desperately need to find meaning in the world. And that's what religion gives us. Religion gives us meaning. That's what utilitarianism, that's what communism, they give meaning to our lives. And that's what we really search for. So what nihilism is nihilism is the absence of those values that give meaning to existence and give meaning to our lives, okay? So that's our first stab at it. That's the nihilism of disorientation. That is, there are no ultimate values that can give meaning to all of existence, okay? Now, actually, Regenster, in that book I mentioned, Nihilism and the Affirmation of Life, it's probably not the right title. I'm not great at remembering titles. He actually has a master argument to say there must be more to nihilism than merely disorientation. And here's his argument. His argument is that Nietzsche continually says that Schopenhauer, his predecessor, was fundamentally a nihilist, okay? But Schopenhauer is a very, very pessimistic philosopher. I'm not going to go to the full story of Schopenhauer's pessimism because it's rather complicated, but the short version is that Schopenhauer said humans are always going to be suffering because we're always at the behest of the will, what Nietzsche would later on characterize in terms of drives, and we're always willing something. And when we will something, I will a coffee right now, I could do with it to perk me up a bit. If we will something like a coffee, that means we lack a coffee. And if we lack it, that's kind of in some sense painful. It's something we don't have, something we'd like to have. We feel regret. We feel, if you like, some kind of sorrow, pain, whatever, depending on the object that we're specifying as the lack. Okay? And what Schopenhauer says is, look, we're always lacking something. That's when we have a desire or will towards it. And that causes some degree of suffering, small or great. And what happens is when we satisfy that will, all that happens is we no longer have that desire for that object, and it's completely negative. There's no positive pleasure in it. It's just the ceasing of that will, and then the next will comes, and then we feel displeasure because we haven't satisfied that will. So it's an endless cycle of, willing and then satisfying the will and then finding the next will. So we're on this endless treadmill of suffering, according to Schopenhauer. I'm not saying I buy into that. Also, I want to put on the board is that this notion of Schopenhauer's that life is irredeemably suffering. And then Schopenhauer makes the value judgment. He says, and he endorses what famously is called the wisdom of Silenus. Silenus was a Roman orator, I think of the 2nd century AD. Silenus said, no, I'm getting Silenus mixed up. It's probably Celsus who said this. No, it's Silenus, sorry. Silenus said, when he was asked, what is a good life for man? He said, "O wretched mortals, the best is for you never to have been born. The second best is to die as soon as possible." Yeah, I know, he's cheery, happy-go-lucky kind of guy. Anyhow, Schopenhauer endorsed that, right? But even if we grant that life is suffering, that doesn't say the world should not be. You need an evaluative perspective. So what a lot of philosophers have said is Schopenhauer has a hidden premise that what justifies life is happiness, but since there can be no happiness, life ought not to be. But that means he can't have disorientation, because remember, disorientation was the belief that there are no ultimate values. But Schopenhauer's an ultimate value, happiness, or the predominance of pleasure over pain, or something of that calculus effect. So Schopenhauer is not disoriented, he's just, if you like, pessimistic. So Regenster introduces a new form of nihilism. He says, look, there is disorientation. That is a nihilism that says there are no ultimate values. But there's also something called the nihilism of despair. Despair is the belief that there are ultimate values, but they cannot be realized, which is exactly Schopenhauer's position. Okay, so now we've got two nihilisms on board. And I think it's fair enough to say that Nietzsche does characterize Schopenhauer as nihilist, and he does have this other form of nihilism, that is despair. Okay, but I've got a couple of questions. First of all, the first question is, look at disorientation and despair. Disorientation is the claim there are no ultimate values, right? Despair is the claim there are ultimate values, but they cannot be realized. Okay, well, they say opposite things. One says there are ultimate values, one says there are no ultimate values. How can these two opposites be the same thing? So Regenster has a problem there. He has some other problems, but I want to cut to the chase. I want to get to the really, really big problem. The really big problem for Regenster's take of nihilisms, both his nihilisms, is the following. Right? Nietzsche says again and again that Christianity or Judeo-Christian values are intrinsically nihilistic. I'll give you a quotation from The Antichrist, sections 18 to 20. The Christian conception of God, a declaration of hostility towards life, nature, will to life. That's important for me, that it's a declaration of hostility towards life. I'll come back to that. They, that is Buddhism and Christianity, belong together as nihilistic religions. And then later on, from his notebooks of the same period, he says, Christianity is a nihilistic religion. It denies nature and the will to life. Okay, so here we have a huge problem. Christianity, he says, is intrinsically nihilistic. Okay, but you'll notice the Christian has neither disorientation. The Christian clearly has ultimate values. The ultimate value is God's providential plan for the whole of existence, right? And he doesn't have despair, because even if he thinks his values can't be realized in this world, they're going to be realized in the next world. Okay? So the Christian has neither disorientation nor despair. So now we have a huge question. Why does he call Christianity intrinsically nihilistic? Okay, there is one little defense you could make. You could say, oh, that Nietzsche thinks Christianity is going to lead to nihilism. The argument would be, and Nietzsche does say this, he says, look, Christianity enshrines a very strong will to truth, because truth is God's word, and we have to respect God's word, we have to respect the truth. In the next lecture, I'll be talking a lot more about what Nietzsche has to say about the Christian and the secular will to truth. But anyhow, the argument would be, oh, Christianity enshrines a will to truth, and it's a will to truth that eventually comes to get us to see that God does not exist, and that's what leads us to nihilism. So that would be a story about how Christianity leads to nihilism. But that is not what the text says. The text says Christianity at its core is nihilistic. And Regenster can't answer that with either despair or disorientation. Because the Christian, as I said, is neither disoriented, he has ultimate values, and he doesn't have despair. Okay, so what I think is really going on, to cut to the chase, is that Nietzsche actually has a deeper form of nihilism. Okay, and to put some pieces on the board, I'll mention the third argument I have against both those forms of nihilism. Both those forms of nihilism are belief. One is the belief that there are no ultimate values. The other one is the belief that there are ultimate values that can't be realized. Now, one of the really important things about Nietzsche, and what makes him different from a lot of the other philosophers you've studied, is Nietzsche doesn't care that much about what we believe. In this sense, he's a follower of Schopenhauer and a precursor of Freud. They had more like the pyramid view of what our mental life is like. And just the top of the pyramid is floating above water. That's consciousness. Basically, they thought what you consciously believe is really a reflection of what's going on much deeper than consciousness. Some philosophers have gone so far as to say that Nietzsche thinks what you consciously believe is epiphenomenal, meaning it's caused, but it doesn't have any causes. It has no causal impact. I think that's going way too far. What I do think is that Nietzsche thinks what you consciously believe is more like is to be read more as a symptom. It's not that it doesn't cause anything, but it's more interesting as a symptom of deeper things that are going on at the level of unconscious, or as I think as Nietzsche would like to put it, at the level of drives. Well, if that is so, then let's go back to disorientation and despair. Those, the way Regenster puts them, are beliefs. But according to the picture I've just given, Nietzsche thinks beliefs aren't all that important. So if nihilism is the most important thing that he's come to expose, and that's how he often presents himself, then how can that be that they're conscious beliefs and yet what we believe isn't all that important? I think there's a deeper lying nihilism underlying both disorientation and despair. And here I'll move back a bit and say, Nietzsche says in Ecce Homo, a book he wrote about his life and his writings, and obviously Ecce Homo is a reference to Jesus. You can see there's a certain element of self-grandeur there. Here is man. He said, he who reads me well reads me first and foremost as a psychologist. And I think that's absolutely right. Nietzsche is not a philosopher you go to get your metaphysics, your theory of truth, your theory of what is, or your epistemology. He's there as a kind of what we call, in German we call a Kulturkritiker, a cultural critic, and a kind of a moral psychologist. Okay, so I want to claim there's a deeper level of nihilism, and it's not a matter of conscious belief. And that is the nihilism, and I'll just quote from Nietzsche. He talks about in the preface of the Genealogy of Morals, section 5, the will turned against life. So what I think is a deeper form of nihilism is what I call affective nihilism, because it affects us at the level of our drives and our affects, expression of those drives. Affective nihilism is when the will is turned against itself. And Nietzsche has a basic story. This is the story of the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals, when he talks about Christianity as the invention of a certain slave caste. And the basic story, which I won't give you fully now, is that there are these people who had wills like everyone else, like their masters. They wanted to be strong, they wanted to be beautiful, they wanted to be dominant, they wanted to be conquering, but because they were slaves, they weren't allowed to express those wills. And so those wills, or those drives, because they couldn't get outward expressions, were turned against themselves. So then they told themselves, it's wrong to want to be strong, it's wrong to want to be beautiful. And you can see how that metamorphosizes into, you should turn the other cheek, you should be meek. In other words, the beginnings of Judeo-Christian values. Okay, so this deeper nihilism, what I call affective nihilism, is when the drives are turned against themselves. And for Nietzsche, that is really life turned against life, because life is nothing but the drives. So he says, look, there are certain people who, because of a lack of power in certain situations, can't express their drives in a healthy way, outwardly in action, so they turn those drives against themselves. Life turned against life. But that is life turned against life, in a sense, because to eliminate the drives is to become nothing, hence nihilism, nihil in Latin meaning nothing. Okay, so that, I think, is the fundamental nihilism for Nietzsche, when life is turned against itself, when drives, instead of seeking outward expression in a healthy way, turn against themselves. He often uses a wonderful phrase which a lot of psychoanalysts have taken up, and I often read Nietzsche as a precursor of Freud in particular. He talks about internalization. The idea is to oppose externalization, drives acting in action, like the nobles, he's thinking of the Greeks or the Romans perhaps, when they have a desire, they act it out. When Achilles is mad about the death of Patroclus, he goes and kills Hector. He expresses his anger very directly. But slaves can't do that. If they're angry at their master, they can't express their anger on the pain of death, so they repress it, they turn those drives inwards. And the drives turn against themselves, so that the Christian moralizes. See, it's one thing, it helps to put on board two different notions. There's repression and suppression. You can suppress a drive by telling yourself, look, like right now, I'm suppressing my drive to a cup of coffee. I mean, I'll answer to that drive when the break comes. But I'm saying, look, I've got to be responsible, finish here, and do my lecture. I'm perfectly aware of my drive to have a cup of coffee. I don't say it's a bad drive. I just say, I'm just not going to act on it now. That is suppressing it, right? But repression is something different. Repression is when you, in a sense, moralize. Nietzsche has a wonderful phrase, moralic acid. It's when you moralize in yourself, you don't just say, I'm not going to act on this drive. You say, I'm wrong to have this drive. Humans shouldn't have this kind of drive. This drive is an affront to God. Well, that's what a lot of Judeo-Christian values do. Like we have various aggressive drives, says Nietzsche. We have various sexual drives. And religions tell us those drives are an affront to God. Those drives are wrong. We shouldn't even have those drives in the first place. So that, for Nietzsche, is the beginnings of a pathology. That is the beginnings where you disown life. And here's a wonderful phrase in the Genealogy of Morals where he says, we become strangers to ourselves. And the meaning of that, and I think that's the real meaning of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, is that we disown certain parts of ourselves, certain drives, so that they become split off to the point that we consciously don't even recognize we have them. We lie to ourselves and say, no, I want to love my neighbor. I have no aggressive impulses. Nietzsche thinks we're actually confused. He thinks both of that is part of us. Yes, there's a part of you that wants to love your neighbor, the conscious part that's been indoctrinated, but there's another part of you that wants to be aggressive to your neighbor, and hence you become split in that beautiful phrase, strangers to ourselves. Okay, so if we've got on board this notion of nihilism, the basic form of nihilism, what I call affective nihilism, as you turned against yourself, or your drives turned against yourself, but you is good enough, because I think Nietzsche identifies you, the I, not with your conscious thought, but with your drives, but that's a matter for another talk. With your drives turned against yourself, that's the fundamental aspect of nihilism that Nietzsche is really interested in. Now, if we think like that, we answer a few of the objections I had to Regenster. First of all, nihilism is not a doctrine. It's not a belief you hold, right? Like the Christian doesn't consciously hold nihilism, but it's something about your very psychological makeup. So it explains, it has a form of nihilism that doesn't have it as a conscious belief, which fits our criticism that Nietzsche wouldn't say a fundamental problem is at the level of belief. Belief are more a reflection, a symptoms of deeper down problems. Okay, now we have an explanation of why Christianity is fundamentally nihilistic. Because on Nietzsche's take, at least, what Christianity demands is a severe repression of the drives, as I said, of these aggressive, sexual and other drives. Okay? And finally, we have an explanation of what those two nihilisms that Regenster mentions have in common. Remember, there's a nihilism of disorientation. There are no ultimate values that give meaning to all of existence. And despair, there are ultimate values, but they cannot be realized, the version that Schopenhauer ascribed to. We can say what those two nihilisms are is they are modern expressions of this fundamental affective nihilism. So I think Nietzsche's view is this. Christianity, or Judeo-Christian values in particular, in the West, introduced this not suppression of drives, but severe self-chastising, moralized repression of drives. And this has made us sick and to a certain extent pathological in Nietzsche's eyes. And hence we become split and become strangers to ourselves. And what disorientation and despair are, it's the modern, they come in the modern world, they come with a kind of nihilism becoming self-conscious. That is, nihilism is finally making its way up from our mere bodily state of drives turned against drives into consciousness. So we give conscious expression to our affective nihilism with either disorientation, there are no ultimate values, or despair. Remember I said, why are those both nihilisms? They say opposite things. They're both nihilisms not because of their content, but because of the causal genesis and because what they really mean and what they really reflect. They reflect our affective nihilism. It's just that now, in the modern age, when a lot of us have become secular and given up God, we now express those nihilisms in quite conscious forms. Okay, I want to make a couple of last points and then I'll open the floor to questions. It's important to see that Nietzsche is not in favor of nihilism, right? And you remember in that passage, the God is dead passage, he says, what must we do to become worthy of the deed, the deed of killing God? Must we not become God? Okay, so what is it to become God? Well, and here he apes the language of Kant. He says, in other places, he says it's to become autonomous, to become lawgivers. So the idea is, for Nietzsche, is that before we had this external authority giving us a law, and those of us who are strong enough to live through nihilism get beyond it. And Nietzsche said of himself, I'm the first person to live through nihilism and get beyond it, they'll be able to give themselves their own values. They'll become their own authorities. They won't need an external authority. And here Nietzsche is in some sense a precursor of the existentialists, people like Sartre, who hammered on this point that you have to become your own authority. Okay, so Nietzsche on the descriptive side is just saying that nihilism is what is going to be the history of Europe for the next 200 years. He's not endorsing it, he's just saying it's a historical inevitability. Now, there are a whole series of Nietzsche interpreters, namely the postmodernists, who think, in some sense, Nietzsche is endorsing it. They agree with Nietzsche on the descriptive side. They say, look, we moderns, we've lost the idea of external authority. Lyotard, a very famous postmodernist philosopher who wrote this famous book called The Postmodern Condition, says postmodernism is an incredulity towards all meta-narratives. Meta-narratives is like a story of what creation is about, like the providential story of God's creation, or what existence is all about. The utilitarian's idea that what we exist for is to increase the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Okay, so Lyotard says we become completely skeptical of all those stories, right? And he says, but in response to that, he says we should become ironic. We don't take any story seriously, and we just play and we move from story to story as it suits us. Now, in fact, that is a deep form of nihilism, no ultimate values. And Nietzsche actually, in some sense, predicted this. He was very prescient. He said that's what was going to happen with weak people. When weak people realize there is no external authority, what they're going to do is they're going to become completely ironic. They're going to feel like they're epigones, this is the end of history, whatever, and there's no story we need to take seriously. And Nietzsche did not endorse that. That is the difference between him and the postmoderns. The postmoderns seems kind of happy that there's no ultimate authority, and they say we shouldn't give any authority to anything. Whereas Nietzsche says, look, those people who are strong enough, and the list is very small, he always puts himself on the list, hence ecce homo. He says those people will be able to create their own values. And that's the challenge he puts out to us moderns. He says, look, once you've realized that there are no external authorities, you'll go through this period of nihilism, you'll say there are no ultimate values, but those of you who are strong enough will be able to create your own ultimate values. And on that happy note, I think I'll stop and open the floor to questions. At the back.
So if everyone's strong and everyone creates their own values autonomously, what did he predict as the outcome? I mean, can everybody be strong and create their ultimate values and there not be chaos and violence and fallout?
Should I repeat that question, please? No. Okay. You're absolutely right. And in fact, one of the things about Nietzsche that I neglected to say is Nietzsche is extremely elitist and extremely condescending. And this is because it looks like he wants to wipe out Christianity, but that's not true. But he was very condescending the way he put it. The most condescending versions let the ideas of the herd, meaning the common people, rule in the herd. That is, he said, for the vast majority of people, religions give some meaning to their life and makes a hard life, a life of suffering bearable. His worry was that Christianity, or Judeo-Christian values in the West, had become too victorious. That is, they've converted everyone, and they're very hegemonic and universalistic, and they demand that everyone subscribe to these values. So he did think that certain people who he thought of weak, need to keep those Christian values. What he was worried about is that Christian values, the morality of compassion, is so universalistic and so powerful, it kind of sucks everyone into its wake. But there's a second problem you're getting at. What if people read Nietzsche as a license to create their own values? And some of them could create horrible values. And it's well known that some people in the 20th century who did take up Nietzsche, I'm thinking particularly of the Nazis, did horrible things and had what we would find of horrible values. And this is how brilliant Nietzsche was. Nietzsche actually said somewhere in Beyond Good and Evil, one of his main books, he said, horrible things will be done in my name. He saw exactly that point. But he was such an elitist and he was so condescending. He said, basically his attitude was, I don't care what idiots do with my text. Let them do what they want. But Nietzsche Nietzsche wanted people to create their own values. That is true. And famously says, here is Zarathustra, his prophet, says, here is my way, where is yours? But there was this question, well, where does that leave people? And a lot of people have a very negative feeling about Nietzsche for this reason. They say, he doesn't give us any politics. He doesn't tell us what the ideal society is. He doesn't really give us any values. He just kind of, and Nietzsche often said this, I am dynamite. I blast other values away, and then I leave it for you to create your own values. Now, as a matter of fact, I have to say, Nietzsche did have his own values. What Nietzsche really valued was culture and great individuals. Great creative individuals. He thought it was the geniuses. As I say, the list is Goethe's always on the list, Beethoven's always on the list, Nietzsche's always on the list, and I like to say Wagner is on the list and then off the list. It's these great geniuses that move culture along. And what Nietzsche really wanted to do with his text is to free up these individuals from the constraints of a morality, of a moral religious worldview that he felt constrains them from realizing their true potential. So, and I always like to say this, that Nietzsche's ideal readers were not members of the herd, including philosophy professors, of which he had a very low opinion. It was the great creative geniuses. But if you look at the history, those have been the people who really got the most out of Nietzsche. I mean, there are tons of brilliant people, authors I can think of, mainly people in the German tradition, the poet Rilke, Thomas Mann, the author, Hermann Hesse, but also in England, D.H. Lawrence. They read Nietzsche and they felt extremely liberated by him. So Nietzsche was a project not addressed to everyone, but addressed to a few, to liberate them. And the final thing I'll say is, when Nietzsche talked, for instance, about having power, he's often mentioned Will to Power, a book he never wrote, a book that he had plans for that his sister wrote. He didn't mean power over others. He fundamentally meant power over oneself. Remember I said we're strangers to ourselves, we're split off, we're going in different directions? Nietzsche said some individuals need to gain power over themselves so they can give themselves direction. That is what he really cared about. That's the ultimate exercise of power that he cared about. But yes, horrible things will be done and have been done in his name. I think there's a question here, and then we'll go that way. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just so with the God is dead, he's projecting a nihilism, or he's predicting a nihilism that's going to happen for the next 2 centuries. He says. Mm-hmm. But isn't that a liberation from the self-defeating nihilism that exists in the fear of God? Are there two distinct things?
Yeah. Yes, you're right. Well, first of all, there are 2 distinct things, because one can be just the nihilism. The fundamental nihilism he would like to address is the drives turned against each other, right? Now, he does think people who have accepted the death of God, like the utilitarians, etc., who care about happiness, who are involved in the morality of compassion, can still have that effective nihilism. Okay, but I think the really important point you're getting at is that I said Nietzsche doesn't endorse nihilism. I really should have said maybe Nietzsche doesn't endorse nihilism as an end state, but he does see it as kind of a necessary condition we need to get through. That is, we have to go through a particular disorientation and despair so we can address the underlying nihilism. Right? But it's really addressing the underlying nihilism that he wants to do, that is, that effective nihilism. And he famously says, I think it's in Daybreak, or Dawn as it's sometimes called, we have to think differently in order one day, perhaps long in the future, to feel differently. So the idea is we'll give up, we'll create values of our own kind, and maybe we'll do that consciously, but one day this will we'll get to the deeper level, the effective level.
So it'll be a long and painful process.
It's a long and painful
process.
One. Hopeful.
Yeah.
See, if what happened is we go through nihilism and we just end up at postmodernism, that would not be a happy result for Nietzsche. What he wants is people who can create strong values, and this is what's really important, back those values with their drives. That is, their drives will be expressed fully in those values, and their drives will not be aimed at merely suppressing themselves. That's what he hopes and that's why he has the model of the artist, because he thinks the artist, I'm not saying the artist is always his model, artist is more the model in the early work. In the latter work it seems to be the philosopher, obviously self-aggrandizement involved here, but he has this idea of a philosopher who uses his drives to express them in outward action in creation of great works of art, like the books of the texts that he created himself. Sorry, there were questions up there, yeah.
Reading Slavoj Žižek's interpretation of Christianity, he sort of seems to argue that Christianity is almost like the the only method to attain true atheism. That Jesus is almost God's way of removing himself as the big other, and thus we're sort of faced with like what he calls the precipice of freedom. In terms of the end of ideology, I think you mentioned the end of ideology, the end of history.
Yeah.
Can Nietzsche be sort of used to understand now what we might sort of say is capitalism's replacement of God? So there's no other way to see sort of economic life or an economic ideology outside of capitalism. So
God, it's a complex question, and there's a lot going on there.
Nietzsche sort of talks about desire. So
Yeah.
in terms of capitalistic desires,
Okay.
we sort of go out and we're played on all these things, sexual desires, through advertising and marketing, and so God seems to sort of moved out of the way, but it's almost now capitalism has become the God, if you like.
Okay, remember I did briefly mention that Nietzsche in some sense agrees with that version that Christianity brings its own demise, because of Christianity really enshrines an incredibly strong will to truth, and will to truth is the one thing that leads us to see there is no God. So that part he agrees with. But on capitalism, let's go back to nihilism. Nihilism is the absence of overriding meaning, that is meaning that values that give meaning to all of life. Now, there can still be people who say value a good career, value their family, right? In fact, Nietzsche characterizes these in section 5 of the preface of Zarathustra, or Zarathustra characterizes them as the last man. And Nietzsche is and Zarathustra are extremely despondent. In fact, it's because of the last man. This is a man who, he says famously, what is a star, and blinks. That is, he has no great heavenly overarching values. He's just got his ordinary little values. And Nietzsche is in despair of that. In fact, Zarathustra, in the end, in that book, he can affirm all of existence. And Nietzsche writes in some of his letters, I'm not as strong as Zarathustra. When I look at the last man with his petty desires, I can't affirm all of existence. He saw that distance between himself and, if you like, his alter ego. The thing about capitalism is, on Nietzsche's view, capitalism enshrines the no great meta-narrative. Right? It enshrines. It's still. Remember, I said nihilism can't be the absence of all values, because our drives give value. Well, capitalism is like a lowest common denominator of just answering our basic drives, drives towards family, drives towards career, etc. But it doesn't look for an overarching meaning. And Nietzsche found that an object of extreme despair. And some people have argued, my colleague Simon May has argued brilliantly, to say, in the end, Nietzsche was still a Christian, because it's fundamental to Christianity, or it's fundamental to religion, to look for a value that gives meaning to all of existence. Why can't we learn to live without a meaning to all of existence? Why can't we just have our petty drives, a drive for a family, a drive for a career, a drive for a better job, whatever, a bigger car or whatever? Well, I think Nietzsche's real objection is really that he thinks that is not the way forward to really great creative individuals. I think at the end his core values are always culture and great individuals that move culture. And he saw this effect of capitalism, the enshrinement of the most basic drives, and no looking for a meta-narratives that give meaning to all of existence, as enshrinement of the lowest common denominator and something antithetical to great culture and great individuals. I'll go here and then there. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry, my eyes move a bit
so one quick
strangely.
question. With regards to these strong people that he referred to, is that called the Übermensch? And another one is that, does he tell us to follow our drives in order to find that meaning and values?
Well, okay, there are two big questions here. The Übermensch is mainly, it's mentioned very little in Nietzsche. It's mentioned in Zarathustra. The best way to think of the Übermensch is, as a scholar, John Richardson, a Nietzsche scholar, in his book Nietzsche System said, he said, look, Nietzsche, when he talks about masters in the genealogy, he talks about people with very limited drives, but they're expressed directly in action. Whereas we moderns, who are much more interesting than those masters, because we're a collection of drives, often conflicting drives, hence we're strangers to ourselves, we have parts of ourselves that are split off, we have drives going in, we're complex, which he admires, we make man interesting. He says, without the slave revolt, which is the institution of Judeo-Christian values, history would be too stupid a thing. We have a certain complexity, but at the price of being all over the place. I think the notion of an Übermensch is, as Richardson said, an Aufhebung. That is, he'd like us not to repress our drives but he'd like us to collect them and give them concerted expression. And to do that, you need what I call sublimation. That is, you've got a wide range of drives, but you've got a master drive that orders all the other drives and gets them to act in concert with the main drives. Now, you said, do we do it? Well, this is a big, big question about Nietzsche. Who does this? And I think, again, this is part of Nietzsche's story, following Schopenhauer, as a precursor of Freud, that he doesn't think it's something we consciously do. It's just some of us are lucky enough to have a very strong master drive, like maybe Leonardo da Vinci's master drive was to artistic and scientific creation, and that makes all the other drives subservient to it. But what Nietzsche is hoping to do with his text, and that is why he writes in this bombastic, incredibly strong rhetorical manner that moves so many of us, is he's trying to get us below the level of conscious. He's hoping one of these geniuses, or a nascent genius, Hermann Hesse, say, or D.H. Lawrence, will read his books and something in him will be liberated so that it can now find full expression and become the active master drive.
Sorry, continuing on with drives. Early on, you were talking about drives and values with regard to Nietzsche. Would a biologist or a post-Darwinian say that drives have values, or would they say that drives are value-free?
Well, I think the basic idea here is, I can't answer so much for the post-Darwinians. They certainly say the drives functionally impel us towards certain things. But the point I'm trying to get at is, on Schopenhauer and Freud and Nietzsche's view, we have conscious values, we even have unconscious values, but it's our drives that are the root cause of all these values. It's our drives that make us value things, right? I think it's also fair to say more directly, our drives value things, except the worry that turns them into little homunculi, little people, because we think of drives valuing as something that a conscious agent does. So if you're very much worried about the homuncular problem, which I think in the end can be answered, but I'm not going to do that here because it takes a long lecture, and say you can think, okay, maybe the drives don't directly value, but they are the cause of us valuing. Right? If I didn't have the drive, if I didn't have the hunger drive or the thirst drive, I just wouldn't value this Coke at all. And the point about, the point about Nietzsche is he thinks our drives are the seat of all our values and the ultimate cause of all our actions. This is in great contradistinction to Kant. Kant talked about if you're merely at the mercy of your drives, you're what he called heteronomous. You can't be moral. He said to be moral is to overcome your drives to a certain extent. It's to become autonomous and just to be if you like, a monster of pure reason. That you do something not because your drives impel you towards it, then you're not acting morally. You're only acting morally when you act purely because your reason tells you it's your duty to do X. But Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and Freud are all of the view that all your actions are ultimately, using Kant's language, heteronomous, driven by your drives.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted, in the same way that we kind of Democrats in the herd disagree about our values and take value from that very disagreement, did Nietzsche foresee that his geniuses would themselves disagree about their values and change the values accordingly?
Well, Nietzsche actually, he railed against Socrates because he thought Socrates is one of these people who institutes the reign of reason, and he thought that was reason as opposed to it's more of the repression of the drives, that Socrates is one of these monsters of reason who says all you should use is your reasons and your drives are something to be scared of. So that's instituting a regime of repression. And at other points he says, in truth, no one is closer to me than Socrates. So what Nietzsche thinks is these great geniuses kind of are in conversation with each other. Admittedly, it's a one-way conversation because Socrates isn't listening to Nietzsche. But Nietzsche is listening to Socrates. And Nietzsche said this beautifully. He said, some are born posthumously. He was very worried about whether he'd ever have readers. His last 6 books he had to pay for their printing. But he was hoping to be genius in the future who would bounce off him. And what he wanted was, he didn't want them to accept him, just like he didn't accept Socrates. He wanted himself to be a point of departure from them. That is one of the reasons why he finds professors of philosophy boring. Because what does a professor of philosophy do? He tries to work out exactly what Nietzsche meant. That is not, Nietzsche didn't mind those readers. He realized that'll help keep his texts alive. But what really Nietzsche was looking for was people who would use Nietzsche's text, possibly deform it to find their own voices. If you're thinking of philosophers, think about Foucault and Heidegger, who both read Nietzsche and then kind of used Nietzsche to create their own ideas. So Nietzsche said this about what he called the masters. He said, a master values himself not by the slaves who's under his jurisdiction, but the other masters who he respects, who are worthy of him. Like Achilles doesn't want to fight a foot soldier or a slave. That's beneath him. They're necessary. He's not against them. He's not trying to eliminate them. We need them. But I get my value, says Achilles, by battling someone worthy of me, Hector. That is exactly how Nietzsche says. Nietzsche says of himself, he thinks if you have genuine self-respect, you find an enemy worthy of yourself. One of his enemies was Socrates. Another one is possibly Jesus / St. Paul, because he thinks St. Paul is the brains behind Jesus. Well, he can see, he's hoping that really the notion is the Greek notion of a gonal struggle. You make yourself stronger by struggling against someone worthy of you. Well, he hopes to be a force, a point of force that others in the future, worthy ones, will struggle against. One last question, and then I think we should break. Yeah.
On denial of life and will turn against itself. Nietzsche, especially on the second essay genealogy, he goes on and on about the fact that what we are repressing is our animal instincts, our kind of violence, aggressiveness, which are natural in us as animals. But later on, like Freud and psychoanalysts, they tend to focus on sex as the fundamental animal instinct which we are repressing. Does Nietzsche actually talk about sex? So how would you combine the two things?
Oh yeah, Nietzsche talks about repression of the sexual drive in the third essay of the Genealogy of Morals when he talks about the aesthetic ideal. But you're fundamentally right that Freud was possibly a monomaniac or possibly a duomaniac. At first he only seems to have libido as the fundamental drive, and then later on he has Thantos, the death drive, and most post-Freudians aren't very happy with the death drive in particular, the drive to become nothing. You'll notice that's an echo of Nietzsche, the will to nothingness. Nietzsche was prolific in his drives. There's some Paul Katsafanis, a Nietzsche scholar, has found 136 drives mentioned in Nietzsche's text. So Nietzsche seems to think there are a lot of drives, and unlike Freud, he doesn't think they're all hardwired. He thinks we can culturally, we can be encultured into a drive. Okay, there are people, for instance, Adler. Adler was a psychoanalyst who had a break with Freud, and he said actually we need to return to Nietzsche. That we need to not be such a monomaniac. You're thinking about, the early psychoanalysts, and not just make the sexual drives the be-all and end-all. There's another part to your question. Can you repeat it? Just repeat your question in toto, and I'll figure the part I haven't answered.
Yeah, no, I was saying how Nietzsche seems to be focused on our animal instinct, defined as aggressiveness.
Right, I've got it, the sexual part. Okay, yeah. It's really interesting what Nietzsche says about the sexual drive, because famously, Nietzsche is a great opponent of the aesthetic ideal, right? He thinks it's part of the religious self, what does he call it? 2,000 years of self-vivisection, of us turned against our drives. So it sounds like he's totally against the aesthetic ideal, but actually he's not. I think it's section 10 of the third essay. He actually talks about what do aesthetic ideals mean in the form of philosophers, right? And remember, think about this. I mean, he either had zero or very few sexual liaisons himself, right? And he was fairly aesthetic. He was, not impoverished. He was on a university pension, but he was wandering around in Sils Maria in the Engadine in Switzerland, or he was wandering in various watering holes, etc. He was very lonely. He kind of lived an aesthetic existence, right? So how can he be so against the aesthetic ideal? And this is a really important point in Nietzsche. When I'm talking about the will to truth in Nietzsche or the aesthetic ideal, Nietzsche is not a philosopher. He's very unlike most philosophers. Most philosophers say, truth is a good, simpliciter. Or the will to being hostile is bad, simpliciter. Nietzsche is never like that. He says, what does this will mean in that individual? So take the aesthetic ideal. He says, look, there are some people who are aesthetic because basically they hate life. They feel weak, they feel impoverished, so they turn against life. He thinks that's the basis of the Judeo-Christian values, right? But there are some people who remove themselves from life, not out of hatred of life, because they actually love life. That is how Nietzsche sees himself. He says, look, there are certain of us philosophers, and we are aesthetic not because we disown our drives, because we want to remove ourselves from the world as a way of engendering our creation. In fact, he uses all these metaphors of the philosopher withdrawing himself so he can have his pregnancy and give birth to his real children. Not literal children, but his works. So Nietzsche says, is aestheticism a bad thing? It depends why you're aesthetic. Are you aesthetic because you hate life and you want to turn against your own drives? Are you aesthetic to remove yourself from life, from the immediate life, from your fellow man, because that is your way of coming back into life, to do your creations, your celebration of life? So now we'll come to the part I didn't answer, the sexual. Nietzsche, I think what he thinks is certain people can sublimate their sexuality. That is, they can turn their sexuality towards their creativity. A good example of someone who both sublimated and lived their sexual life is Picasso, right, who had 1 billion lovers, right? I exaggerate, but he had many lovers. And what is really interesting is you see from Picasso's diary is how he cannibalized his relationships. That is, he engendered fights in his relationship. He had all kinds of fights with his lovers, and he actually engendered them because it led to his creativity. It expressed itself in his artistic work. So his primary drive was towards his artistic work, and he was not ascetic. He didn't renounce sexuality, but he redirected his sexuality and used it to enhance his creative work. So what's Nietzsche's view on the sexual drive? He thinks it can be employed in a certain way. Mere repression, where it gets split off and ends up in pathological symptoms like skin rashes or psychoses, Nietzsche, just like Freud, didn't approve of. But what Nietzsche thought is some people can reharness their sexual drives and express it in their creativity, and that Nietzsche was in favour of. Actually, we do have times. Does anyone remember when this session's meant to end? I wrote times down, but at 11.
Did you?
Okay, fine. Let's go to 11. That's fine by me. Are there other questions? Okay, if there is not, I want to put one more piece on the table, which I didn't in the lecture because I only had so much time. I'll keep talking until there's a question. That's my practice. I do think sublimation is really, really important for Nietzsche, and it explains a lot, because there is these huge worries about, is he just some kind of express my drives outward, be aggressive, destroy other people? And I've tried to kind of finesse that point by saying, no, what Nietzsche wants is not power over others, but power over yourselves, okay? And in this, he's actually rehearsing something that he got from the Romantics. The Romantics, I'm thinking of people like Novalis, Hölderlin, he particularly read Hölderlin. These were people writing in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and they had this idea that Germany doesn't have a genuine culture. Most of them, I'm talking about the German Romantics. Schlegel's brothers were also very important for this. And they said to have a genuine culture is to have unity. And they thought what happens in our modern culture is we become fragmented. Because the point about religion is it gives a core, it gives common values to everyone, it gives a unity. But now we're living in a post-religious age and we don't have that unity, so everyone just goes whatever direction they want. And they had this idea that they thought the same about mythology. They thought religion gives unity, the Greek myth, well, that was a religion, that gave them unity, gave them a sense of what's appropriate to do. It's appropriate to act like Achilles acts, for instance, or it's appropriate to act like Agamemnon acts. Those gave archetypes which gave enshrined norms of appropriateness and hence gave a centre. So the Romantics said, look, we moderns lack unity. And Nietzsche was very, very worried about this lack of unity. He thought this lack of unity is important, A, for a genuine culture, and B, for us to be genuine individuals. Okay, but you hear the word unity and you wonder, well, what the hell does it mean? It's repeated endlessly. The interesting thing is Nietzsche gives a gloss, a really interesting gloss on what unity is. Unity is this notion of sublimation. And sorry for those of you who have heard it before, but I always like to use the example of Freud's Leonardo, because Freud wrote an essay on Leonardo da Vinci, and it's his main work on sublimation, but Freud didn't do a good job of explaining what sublimation is. According to Freud, Leonardo was was sexually inactive. This is historically wrong. We now have records that show that's not true. But according to Freud, Leonardo was fundamentally asexual, but he harnessed all his sexual energies towards artistic and scientific creativity. Okay, but what Freud is really bad at explaining is how this sublimation occurs. But Nietzsche has a story to tell about that. There are other reasons why Freud has problems on sublimation, but I can't get into that here. though I've written an essay, Nietzsche and Freud on repression and sublimation. You can look it up on the web. Nietzsche's version of Leonardo would be the following, and in fact he actually talks about Leonardo in some notes and says roughly the story I'm going to say. That is, we said Leonardo had a master drive. His master drive was towards artistic and scientific creation. He had other drives, a sexual drive, and let's say his main sexual drive was towards sexual congress with young boys. Okay, that's the way Freud seems to tell it. Okay, well what happens is, with sublimation, with repression, you merely repress that drive. Maybe you're asexual, and maybe you come out with weird symptomology, skin rashes, whatever. But if you sublimate, what happens is, rather than repressing the drive, you redirect it. So the story, the Nietzschean story on Leonardo would be, he had this sexual drive. The sexual drive wants him to literally possess male bodies. But his master drive, his strongest drive, is towards artistic and scientific creativity. And rather than repressing that drive, it's strong enough to deal with it, not by repressing. When you've got a master drive that's not very strong, it deals with other drives by pushing them down. But if it's strong enough, if it's self-confident, if you like to use that language enough, it can harness the drive. So that instead of possessing the drive slightly gets redirected. The sexual drive's primary impetus is towards sexual congress, possession of male bodies. Right? But it gets redirected, and as you know, Leonardo was obsessed with doing perfect representation of male bodies. So in a way, that's harnessing that sexual drive, but it's redirecting it to an aim that is now consonant with the master drive. Because possessing perfect representation of male bodies, he did all these diagrams of perfect male bodies, no diagrams of perfect female bodies. In fact, notoriously often got the female body quite wrong. That is now an expression of the sexual drive, but in a way that's consonant with the master drive. That is what Nietzsche's aim is. Nietzsche's ideals individuals are individuals who have achieved a certain kind of power over themselves, self-mastery through sublimation. And it's through that sublimation that we become genuine individuals and become genuine agents. But that again is another story that I can't give here.